The mountains of eastern Afghanistan stretched endlessly under a sky bleeding into twilight, their jagged peaks casting long shadows across valleys where ancient trade routes had given way to modern warfare. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. At 32 years old, he'd spent nearly a decade in the Marine Corps, with 3 tours in this unforgiving landscape that had become as familiar as it was deadly. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the quiet intensity of a man who'd seen too much but never looked away. The reconnaissance mission had started like dozens before it. 6 Marines moving through the highlands at dawn, checking reported enemy activity near the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested a small cell, maybe 15 fighters using the caves as a waypoint. Standard procedure: observe, report, extract. But intelligence, Jake had learned, was often just educated guessing dressed up in confident briefings. The reality waiting in those mountains was something else entirely. They'd been moving along a ridgeline when the first shots cracked through the thin air. Not the sporadic fire of a small group, but the coordinated volleys of a significant force. Jake's team had stumbled into something much larger, a staging ground for what looked like a major offensive. In the chaos of that first contact, as bullets chewed up the rocky ground and RPGs screamed overhead, the team had scattered. Jake had provided covering fire as his men retreated down the opposite slope, his M4 carbine barking in controlled bursts. He'd been the last to move, and that decision had cost him everything. A mortar round had obliterated the path behind him, sending tons of rock cascading down the mountainside. When the dust cleared, Jake found himself cut off, alone on the wrong side of the valley, with the sun sinking fast and the sound of enemy fighters regrouping echoing off the stone walls. He'd keyed his radio, confirming his team had made it out, then gone silent, moving quickly to find defensible ground before darkness made travel impossible. The shepherd's shelter he found was little more than stacked stones and a partially collapsed roof, but it offered a view of the valley floor and some protection from the biting wind that swept down from the peaks. Jake settled in, taking inventory with the methodical calm of experience. 3 magazines for his rifle, maybe 90 rounds total. His sidearm with 2 full clips. 4 grenades, a combat knife, his radio, thankfully intact, a single bottle of water and 2 energy bars. Not much to last the night, let alone survive what was gathering below. Through his night vision scope, Jake watched the valley come alive. Dozens of fires flickered into existence, and around them, men gathered in groups, checking weapons, loading vehicles, moving with the purpose of an army preparing for battle. He counted positions, estimated numbers, his mind cataloging every detail. 100 fighters became 150, then kept climbing. By full dark, he knew he was looking at nearly 200 enemy combatants, and they weren't just passing through. This was a staging area for something big. Jake pulled out his radio, the device feeling heavy in his hands. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to hide and pray they didn't search the ridgeline before dawn. But he knew what he was seeing. This force wasn't here by accident. They were positioned less than 15 kilometers from Firebase Osprey, where his former battalion was stationed. If this army moved at dawn, they'd hit the base with overwhelming numbers before reinforcements could arrive. Hundreds of Marines, soldiers, support personnel, all of them sitting ducks if they didn't know what was coming. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. Making this call would save lives, but it would also paint a target on his back that would last until extraction or death, whichever came first. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the men and women at Osprey. Some he'd served with, trained with, shared foxholes and bad coffee with. Others he'd never met, kids fresh from training who'd never seen real combat. They deserved a fighting chance. He pressed the button. Static crackled, then a familiar voice cut through. Osprey Actual, this is Reaper 6, do you copy? Jake kept his voice low, barely above a whisper. The response came within seconds, professional but urgent. Reaper 6, this is Osprey Actual. We copy. Your team reported you cut off. What's your status? Jake recognized the voice. Colonel Sarah Chen, his former battalion commander. A woman who'd earned her rank through competence and courage, not politics. They'd butted heads more than once, Jake's aggressive tactics clashing with her by-the-book approach, but he'd never doubted her commitment to bringing her people home. Osprey Actual, I'm mobile but surrounded. I've got eyes on a significant enemy force. Estimate 200 fighters staging in valley coordinates I'm transmitting now. They're preparing for a major offensive. Probable target your location. Estimated move time sunrise. The silence that followed lasted only heartbeats, but Jake felt each one. Then Chen's voice came back, stripped of protocol. Pure command. Reaper 6, confirm that count. 200? Jake adjusted his scope, double-checking. Confirmed. This isn't a raid, Colonel. This is an army, and they're coming for you. What followed was a rapid exchange of information. Jake transmitted coordinates, described vehicle types, identified what looked like mobile artillery pieces being positioned. Chen's questions were sharp, precise, already thinking 3 steps ahead. When she asked about his extraction options, Jake gave it to her straight. Not happening before dawn, ma'am. I'm pinned down, and any movement will compromise my position. I can feed you intelligence through the night, but that's all I've got to give. Another pause. Longer this time. Jake could almost hear the calculations running through Chen's mind, the weight of command forcing impossible choices. Reaper 6, I need you to maintain observation and report any changes. We're working on getting you out, but you're right about the timing. Can you hold that position? Jake looked at his meager supplies, then at the army spread below him. I'll hold. Ma'am, just make sure it counts. Chen's response was firm, almost gentle. It will, Marine. Osprey actual out. The night that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced, and he'd endured more than his share of hell. Every hour he transmitted updates, tracking movement patterns, identifying leadership elements, noting ammunition dumps and fuel storage. But staying in one place meant certain discovery, so Jake began a dangerous dance, moving his position every 30 to 40 minutes, always staying within sight of the valley, but never settling long enough to be pinpointed. The terrain became both enemy and ally. The rocky ridgeline offered countless hiding spots but made silent movement nearly impossible. Every footstep risked dislodging stones that would clatter down the slope. Jake moved like a ghost, testing each placement before committing his weight, sometimes taking 10 minutes to cover 20 meters. His knees protested, old injuries from past deployments flaring with each crouch and crawl. But pain was just information, and he'd learned long ago to file it away and keep moving. Around midnight, Jake heard voices below his position. A patrol, 4 men moving up the ridgeline with flashlights, sweeping the area. They were 50 meters away and closing. Jake pressed himself into a crevice between 2 boulders, controlling his breathing, his hand on his knife. The rifle would be faster but louder, and noise would bring the entire army down on him. He watched through the gap in the rocks as the lights played across the stones. Heard the men talking in Pashto, their voices casual, bored even. They were checking boxes, going through the motions, not really expecting to find anything. One of them stopped 10 feet from Jake's position, so close Jake could hear the man's breathing, could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes. The fighter stood there for an eternity, or maybe 30 seconds. Jake couldn't tell anymore. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing based on heartbeats and threat assessment. Then a voice called from below, impatient, and the man turned away, rejoining his companions as they moved further up the ridge. Jake waited 10 full minutes after their lights disappeared before moving again, his hands shaking slightly as adrenaline drained away. He keyed his radio, voice barely audible. Osprey actual, Reaper 6, enemy conducting patrols on the ridgeline. They're looking for someone. Chen's response was immediate. Copy that. Can you evade? Jake shifted position, scanning the darkness. So far. How's the plan looking? What Chen told him next changed everything. The enemy force wasn't just targeting Firebase Osprey. Intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting a coordinated attack on 3 positions simultaneously. A major push designed to overwhelm coalition forces in the region. Jake's discovery had exposed the main staging area, but hitting it would require more than Osprey's resources. Chen was coordinating with Division Command, calling in air assets, repositioning ground forces. But it all took time, and time was measured in hours they might not have. We need you to keep feeding us information, Chen said. Every detail helps us build the strike package. But Jake, she used his first name, breaking protocol, and that told him everything about how serious this had become. If you have to go dark to survive, you do it. The intelligence you've already provided is invaluable. Don't die being a hero. Jake almost smiled at that. Little late for that advice, Colonel. He signed off and moved again, finding a new vantage point where he could watch the northern approach to the valley. What he saw there made his blood run cold. More vehicles arriving, technical trucks with mounted machine guns, and what looked like anti-aircraft weapons being set up. They were preparing for a response, expecting coalition air power. This was more sophisticated than typical insurgent operations. Someone down there knew what they were doing. He reported it all, his voice steady despite exhaustion creeping in. 3 a.m. came and went. 4. The temperature dropped, and Jake's breath came in visible clouds. He'd put on every layer he had, but the cold still seeped into his bones, making his fingers stiff, his reactions slower. He forced himself to eat one of the energy bars, the food tasteless but necessary. Dehydration and hunger could kill as surely as bullets, and he needed every advantage to make it to dawn. At 4:30, Jake's radio crackled with a different voice. "Reaper 6, this is Guardian 2-1. How copy?" Jake's chest tightened. Guardian 2-1 was Marcus Rodriguez's call sign. Marcus, who'd been Jake's roommate at boot camp, his best friend through 3 deployments, the closest thing to a brother Jake had ever known. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either could count, had made promises over bad whiskey about being there when it mattered most. "Guardian 2-1, I copy." "That really you, Marcus?" The relief in the response was audible. "It's me, brother. Heard you got yourself into some trouble." Despite everything, Jake felt himself grin. "Just a regular Tuesday, man. What are you doing on this net?" Marcus's tone shifted, becoming serious. "I'm leading the extraction team. We're wheels up in 90 minutes, hitting your position at first light. Colonel's calling in the big guns for a strike on that valley, but we're getting you out first. Just need you to hold on a little longer." They talked for a few minutes, the conversation a lifeline in the darkness. Marcus updated Jake on mutual friends, who was where, who'd gotten promoted, who'd rotated home. Normal stuff, the kind of talk that happened in the barracks or during long convoys when men needed to remember there was a world beyond the war. But underneath it all was the unspoken weight of what they both knew. Jake's position was compromised. The enemy was actively searching. The extraction would be hot, coming in under fire, and the odds of everyone making it out were far from certain. "Marcus," Jake said finally, "if this goes sideways..." His friend cut him off immediately. "Stop. Don't even finish that sentence. We're getting you out. And we're all going home. That's the only way this ends. You hear me?" Jake wanted to believe it, wanted to feel that certainty. "I hear you." Marcus's voice softened. "Remember, Sangjan, when that entire building came down and we thought you were gone? You clawed your way out of rubble, walked 3 kilometers on a broken leg to reach the rally point. You're the toughest son of a bitch I know, Jake. This is just another Tuesday, right?" Jake remembered. Remembered the darkness, the crushing weight, the terror of being buried alive. Remembered forcing himself to stay calm, to work the problem, to survive because giving up wasn't an option. "Just another Tuesday," he repeated. They signed off, and Jake found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in hours. Hope, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that the Corps had beaten into him. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, black fading to deep blue at the edges. Jake watched the valley below, seeing the enemy force beginning to stir, men moving with increased purpose as dawn approached. This was it, the final countdown. He transmitted one more update, giving Chen everything he could see, every last detail that might help. Then movement caught his eye, closer than before. A group of fighters, maybe 20 strong, moving up the ridgeline in a organized search pattern. They'd figured out roughly where he had to be based on his radio transmissions, and now they were sweeping the area systematically. Jake had maybe 10 minutes before they reached his position, and nowhere left to run. He made his choice. Pulling back from the edge, Jake found a depression in the rocks, a small hollow that offered some cover and a clear field of fire. He laid out his remaining grenades, checked his magazines one last time. 3 full mags for the rifle, 78 rounds. 2 clips for his pistol, 30 rounds. 4 grenades. If he was smart and lucky, he might hold them off for 5 minutes. That would have to be enough. Jake keyed his radio one last time. "Osprey Actual Reaper 6. Enemy has my position. I'm going to engage and buy whatever time I can. Make sure that strike counts." Chen's response was immediate. Urgent. "Reaper 6. Negative. Extract is inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Do not engage. Repeat. Do not engage. Find cover and wait for Guardian." 12 minutes. Jake looked at the approaching fighters. Now 6 minutes away and closing fast. He could try to hide, hope they missed him in the pre-dawn darkness. Or he could do what he'd trained his entire adult life to do. The choice really wasn't a choice at all. Osprey actual. I can't wait 12 minutes. Tell Guardian to come in hot. He switched channels. Marcus, it's about to get loud up here. I'll mark my position with green smoke when I hear the birds. Come get me, brother. Jake didn't wait for a response. He moved to the edge of his cover, sighting through his scope at the approaching group. They were spread out, professional, moving with the confidence of soldiers who'd done this before. Jake picked his targets, the ones who looked like leaders, the ones coordinating the others. His first shot would start a timer that wouldn't stop until extraction or death. He exhaled slowly, letting his heart rate settle, finding that calm center that existed in the space between heartbeats. His finger took up slack on the trigger. The lead fighter raised his hand, signaling the others to spread wider. Jake's world narrowed to the scope, the target, the squeeze. The rifle cracked, and the ridgeline exploded into chaos. Jake's first shot dropped the leader mid-step. His second took down the man trying to drag his companion to cover, shifting targets, firing in controlled pairs. Jake worked through his magazine with the precision of thousands of hours of training. The enemy scattered, returning fire wildly, not yet sure exactly where he was. Jake dropped back, reloaded, moved 3 meters to his right, popped up in a new position and fired again, dropping 2 more before ducking back. The key was movement, never firing from the same spot twice, making them think there were multiple shooters. He threw a grenade, the explosion sending shrapnel and confusion through their ranks. But there were too many, and they were learning fast. Fire began to concentrate on his general area. Bullets spanging off rocks, sending stone chips flying. Jake felt something hot score across his left shoulder, pain blooming bright and immediate. He ignored it, shifting position again, firing until his second magazine ran dry. The sky was lighter now, dawn breaking properly over the mountains. Jake could hear engines in the distance, both from the valley below where the main enemy force was mobilizing and from somewhere to the west. The helicopters maybe, if he was lucky. He reloaded his last rifle magazine, his hands slick with blood from his shoulder wound. A fighter rushed his position, and Jake met him with 3 rounds center mass. Another came from a different angle, and Jake's pistol barked twice, the man going down hard. They were getting braver, realizing he was alone, moving to flank and overwhelm him. Jake pulled the pin on his second grenade, counted 2 seconds, then hurled it at a cluster of rocks where he'd seen muzzle flashes. The blast was satisfying, but it didn't slow them down. His rifle clicked empty. Jake dropped it, drawing his pistol as 2 fighters crested the rocks to his left. He fired 3 times, dropping one and sending the other diving for cover. His slide locked back. Empty. He ejected the magazine, slammed in his last one, 15 rounds between him and whatever came next. Then he heard it, the distinctive whoomp 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 of helicopter rotors getting louder, closer. Through the growing light, Jake saw them, 2 Blackhawks coming in fast and low with Apache gunships providing escort. The cavalry had arrived, but so had the entire enemy force from the valley. Hundreds of fighters now aware of the helicopters and moving to intercept. Jake grabbed his last smoke grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it as far as he could into an open area 20 meters away. Green smoke billowed up, marking the landing zone. He keyed his radio. Guardian, Reaper 6, LZ marked green smoke. Be advised heavy enemy presence on the ridgeline and moving up from valley floor. Marcus's voice came back, calm despite the chaos. We see you, brother. Keep your head down. The Apaches are about to clear the way. What happened next was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The Apache gunships opened up, their chain guns ripping through enemy positions with devastating precision. 30-millimeter rounds tore through rocks and flesh, suppressing the fighters around Jake's position. The Blackhawks came in hard, flaring at the last second, their door gunners laying down covering fire. Jake ran. Every step jarred his wounded shoulder, but he pushed through the pain, covering the 20 meters to the LZ as bullets kicked up dust around his feet. The lead Blackhawk touched down, and Marines poured out, Marcus in front, his weapon up and firing in controlled bursts. Jake, move your ass! Marcus's voice cut through the gunfire, and Jake forced his legs to pump harder. He could see his friend's face now, see the determined expression that said failure wasn't an option. 10 meters. 5. Something hammered into Jake's leg, spinning him sideways. He went down hard, the world tilting crazily. Then Marcus was there, grabbing him, hauling him up, half carrying, half dragging him toward the helicopter. Other Marines formed a protective cordon, their fire precise and overwhelming. They reached the bird, and hands pulled Jake inside. Marcus jumped in after him, still firing as the helicopter lifted off, the LZ disappearing in a storm of dust and spent brass. The door gunner kept up a steady stream of fire as they climbed, the Apache escorts covering their withdrawal. Jake lay on the deck of the helicopter, corpsman already working on his wounds, cutting away gear, calling out injuries. His shoulder burned, and his leg was a mass of pain, but he was alive. He was flying. He'd made it. Through the open door, he watched the valley fall away. Even from here, he could see the chaos below, the enemy force scrambling, and in the distance, more aircraft approaching. The strike Chen had coordinated, coming to finish what Jake's intelligence had started. It would be hours before they'd know the full impact. But Jake had done his part. The warning had been sent, received, and acted upon. Marcus knelt beside him, his face a mix of relief and anger and pride. "You crazy bastard. You couldn't just hide, could you?" Jake managed a weak smile. "Where's the fun in that?" His friend shook his head, but he was smiling too. "Just another Tuesday, right?" Jake's eyes were getting heavy, shock and exhaustion catching up now that the adrenaline was fading. "Yeah, just another Tuesday." The last thing he heard before darkness took him was the steady beat of the rotors carrying him home, and Marcus's voice telling him to hang on, that they weren't done yet, that there were more Tuesdays ahead. Jake believed him. 3 weeks later, Jake sat in a military hospital in Germany, his leg in a cast, his shoulder still stiff with healing tissue. The doctor said he'd been lucky. The bullet in his leg had missed the bone and major arteries. The shoulder wound was clean. He'd be back to full duty in 6 months, maybe less, with physical therapy. Lucky, they called it, as if luck had anything to do with surviving a night surrounded by 200 enemy fighters. Colonel Chen had visited, bringing news in a small box. The enemy offensive had been broken before it started, the airstrikes destroying most of their capability and scattering the survivors. Firebase Osprey had been reinforced and relocated to a more defensible position. The intelligence Jake had provided had been featured in briefings all the way up to the Pentagon. The entire operation was being studied as a textbook case of individual initiative and inter-service coordination. The box contained medals, ribbons that meant something in the military hierarchy but felt hollow compared to what they represented. Chen had been straightforward about it. "These don't bring back the ones we've lost, and they don't erase what you went through. But they're a reminder that what you did mattered. You saved lives, Jake. A lot of them." After she left, Jake had sat holding the box, thinking about the men and women who'd been at Osprey that night, unaware of what was coming for them until his radio call changed everything. He thought about the fighters in the valley, many of whom had died in the strikes that followed. War was nothing but choices and consequences, and Jake had made his choice knowing full well what it would cost. Marcus visited every day, usually bringing contraband food from off-base and stories from the battalion. They'd talk about everything and nothing, the way friends do when words matter less than just being present. On the 3rd week, Marcus brought a different kind of news. "They want you to talk to some people when you get back," Marcus said carefully. "Other guys who've been through similar situations. The head doctors think you'd be good at it, helping them process everything." Jake had expected something like this. The nightmares had started within days of the extraction. Vivid replays of that night, where he made different choices and everyone died because of it. The guilt was worse than the wounds, a constant weight that made breathing difficult sometimes. "I don't know what to tell them," Jake admitted. "Half the time I don't know why I'm still here and better men aren't." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "You're here because you made impossible choices under impossible circumstances and refused to quit. You're here because a couple hundred Marines and soldiers woke up on the morning of November 3rd and didn't get hit by an overwhelming attack. That's not luck, Jake, that's you. It helped a little. Not enough to make the guilt disappear, but enough to make it manageable. The therapists talked about survivor's guilt, about PTSD, about the long road to processing trauma. Jake listened, participated, tried to do the work. Some days were better than others. 2 months after the incident, Jake was cleared to travel. The Corps flew him back to the States, to Camp Pendleton, where his battalion was based. There was a ceremony, more speeches than Jake wanted to hear, but he endured it. Afterward, Marcus drove him to a different destination, refusing to explain where they were going. They ended up at a small house in San Diego, modest and neat, with a Marine Corps flag hanging by the front door. Marcus killed the engine and turned to Jake. "Rodriguez family lives here, Miguel Rodriguez. He was one of the Marines at Osprey the night you made that call. His dad's a retired gunnery sergeant. They asked if they could meet you." Jake's throat tightened. "Marcus, I don't—" His friend put a hand on his shoulder. "They're not looking for a hero, brother. They just want to say thank you to the man who helped bring their son home. Can you do that?" Jake could. The door opened before they reached it, and Miguel Rodriguez stood there in civilian clothes, looking young despite his combat veteran status. Behind him were his parents, his mother with tears already streaming down her face. They didn't want stories or explanations. Miguel's mother just hugged Jake, held him like he was one of her own children, and whispered, "Thank you," over and over. They had dinner together, the conversation ranging from Marine Corps stories to family gossip to Miguel's plans for college. It was normal, human, grounding in a way Jake hadn't experienced since before the deployment. As they were leaving, Miguel's father, the retired gunny, pulled Jake aside. "My son told me what happened that night," the older man said quietly. "How close it came to being a massacre. What you did staying out there alone, that took balls and brains in equal measure. The Corps needs more like you." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. The gunny continued, "But more than that, it took heart. You could have hidden, saved yourself, and no one would have blamed you. But you made the hard call because other people's lives mattered more than your own safety. That's not something they can teach in boot camp. That's character." Over the following months, Jake met more families, some through official channels, others through the informal network of military connections. Each meeting was difficult and healing in equal measure. He heard about kids who were graduating high school, about marriages and grandchildren, about futures that existed because of choices made on a cold night in the Afghan mountains. The nightmares didn't stop, but they changed. Instead of endless replays of death and failure, Jake began dreaming of the helicopter ride out, of Marcus's smile, of green smoke against a dawn sky. Progress, the therapists called it. Jake called it learning to live with what he'd done and who he'd become because of it. 6 months after the incident, Jake was medically cleared for full duty. He stood in Colonel Chen's office listening to his options. He could return to combat rotation, his wounds healed enough for field deployment. He could take an instructor position, training the next generation of Marines. He could even pursue a medical retirement if he felt the psychological toll was too great. Jake thought about the men and women he'd met, the families who'd thanked him, the bonds he'd forged with his brothers in arms. He thought about Marcus and Miguel and all the others who depended on good leadership and skilled Marines to keep them alive. The choice really wasn't hard. "I want to train new guys." "Ma'am," he said, "pass on what I've learned. Make sure the next batch is ready for what's out there." Chen smiled, approval evident. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. We need men with your experience, showing the new generation not just how to fight, but why we fight, how to make the hard calls when it matters." As Jake left her office, he paused at the battalion memorial wall, reading the names of Marines who hadn't made it home. Some he'd known personally, others were just names, but each one represented a life, a family, a future cut short. Jake pressed his hand against the cool stone, making a silent promise. He'd honor them by doing what they couldn't, by being there for the ones who came after, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Outside, Marcus was waiting, leaning against his truck with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Jake with a grin. "So, what's the verdict?" Jake took a sip, letting the hot liquid chase away the morning chill. "Instructor position. Looks like you're stuck with me stateside for a while." Marcus laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Thank God. Sarah was worried you'd volunteer for another deployment. She's already planning a welcome home party." Sarah was Marcus's wife, a force of nature who'd adopted Jake as extended family years ago. The thought of her cooking and her relentless positivity made Jake smile genuinely, for the first time in months. They drove through Pendleton's gates, past rows of barracks and training facilities, past Marines running in formation and practicing urban warfare tactics. This was Jake's world, his purpose, his family. The scars would always be there, physical and psychological, reminders of that night and all the nights that came before. But so would the memories of helicopter rides and green smoke and brothers who refused to leave anyone behind. Just another Tuesday, Jake thought, watching the sun climb over California hills so different from Afghan mountains. Except it hadn't been just another Tuesday. It had been the night that defined who he was and who he would become. A night when radio calls saved battalions and choices meant survival. A night that proved what Jake had always believed, that the only way through hell was straight ahead, doing the next right thing until dawn finally broke. The truck rolled on through morning traffic, carrying Jake Morrison toward whatever future awaited. Behind him lay mountains and memories, wounds and valor, sacrifice and survival. Ahead lay classrooms and training grounds, new Marines who needed to learn how to stay alive in a world that wanted them dead. And somewhere in between was a man learning to live with being a hero when he'd only ever tried to be a good Marine. That, Jake decided, was enough. It had to be.